Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program, and thanks so much for being here. I'm Marcia Eli from the Brooklyn Public Library's Center for Brooklyn History and the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. Tonight, we have the privilege of hosting a conversation with Chad Williams about his new book, The Wounded World, W.E.B. Du Bois and the First World War. Chad Williams is the Samuel J. and Augusta Spector Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University. He is the author of the award-winning book, Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in the World, and the co-editor of Charleston Syllabus, Readings on Race, Racism, and Racial Violence. His writings and op-eds have appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Time, and The Conversation. Our moderator tonight is Leah Wright Rigueur. She is a political historian whose scholarship includes 20th century United States political and social history, modern African American history with an emphasis on race and political ideology, the American presidency, and protest and unrest in the United States. Her award-winning book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics and the Pursuit of Power, describes more than 4 decades of American political and social history. I'm excited for this conversation, but before I hand it over to Professors Williams and Rigueur, I have a few quick notes for you. First, we have put a link in the chat to the local community bookstore so that you can explore The Wounded World on your own, and if you so desire, purchase a copy from an independent business. Second, you have the option for closed captioning tonight. That button is at the bottom of your screen. And finally, I hope you'll share your questions this evening. Type them throughout the program into the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your screen. And so with that, it is my enormous honor to welcome our guests tonight. Thank you both so much for being here. You can join me on screen, and I'm really excited to hear this conversation, and I turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Marcia, so much for that really lovely introduction. And that entreaty for everyone to join in the conversation by putting your questions into the Q&A box so that we can have a really well-rounded discussion. And if you're anything like me, I know you have lots and lots of questions for Dr. Williams because he has written a really wonderful and quite provocative book about W.E.B. Du Bois, who we thought perhaps that we knew, but has provided an entirely new reading and new side of Du Bois. So I can't wait to jump into this. I also want to say thank you to the Center for Brooklyn History for having us here today and for hosting this really lovely conversation. And so I wanted to start out, before we jumped into the questions, I wanted to say first, congratulations, Chad, on the book. Right. I remember being at the Radcliffe Institute on our fellowship year, and you were doing a very big presentation on your works in progress. And I remember thinking, wow, when this book is done, it's going to be huge. And I was right. And one thing I have to mention about this beautifully written book is that it takes us on a journey. Right? It has romance, it has disaster, it's a thriller, it's a mystery. The book is broken into 3 parts: hope, disillusion, and failure. And I have to say, it's a roller coaster. And I don't know if this was your intention, but each section of the books takes us through those very same emotions. Although you ultimately end not on failure, but on I think an uplifting note. And so this brings me to my first question, which is, tell us how you got here. Tell us about the origins of the book, how you framed it out, how you came to these conclusions. Yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you, Leah, my friend, for being in conversation with me. I remember those Radcliffe conversations and just trying to think about how am I going to get this book done. So it's really thrilling to be able to talk about it with you and to engage with everyone about the book. So the origins of this book really go back to graduate school. When I was working on my doctoral dissertation, which would become my first book, Torchbearers of Democracy, African-American Soldiers in the World War I era, I was doing research at the University of Massachusetts, and I had seen a reference to Du Bois' World War I materials. And I literally had no idea what it was. I thought it might be interesting. It's Du Bois, so I might as well check it out. I go to the library. I asked the librarian to see these Du Bois World War I materials, again, not knowing what to expect. She returns with 6 microfilm reels. So now I'm really intrigued, like, okay, what's going on here? I load the first reel and I slowly start to see this manuscript. As I keep doing more and more research, I learned that the manuscript is over 800 pages long. And it's Du Bois writing about the Black experience in the First World War. What would have been the definitive history of the Black experience in the war, a manuscript that he never finished and was ultimately never completed. In addition to this remarkable manuscript, all of Du Bois's research materials and all of his correspondence related to this project that he spent 20 years working on. And to my astonishment, no historian had talked about it. Of all the works written about Du Bois, this incredible project, which would have been one of his most significant works of history, had never been explored. So at that moment, I was hooked. I knew that I needed to learn more about this book, what it was about, why he never finished it, but ultimately what it tells us about Du Bois, what it tells us about his life, his work, his intellectual and political evolution, but even more than that, what it tells us about his place in the broader struggle for freedom and democracy for Black people in the 20th century.
Yeah, so I thought I'd jump on that. First of all, I mean, I think Professor Williams might even be understating how significant this book is. And one of the things that you really do quite beautifully is that you weave bits and pieces and really important pieces of that 800-page manuscript into your own
Yeah.
text. So you're not only telling the story, I think, of Du Bois and Du Bois's failure to publish this manuscript, but you're also giving us some glimpses into just how significant the Wounded World would have been had it come out. So
Right.
that is incredible. I'm also interested, I think, in the international component of the Wounded World. And that sounds, that's deceptive. Of course, it's has an international component, but I'm interested in the international basis. So I thought I'd start out by talking about Du Bois's time in Germany. Now, he writes so fiercely about Germany even before the unfolding of World War I. Like, right as the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand is happening, Du Bois is like, I recognize the strut of Southern white supremacists. I love that line from the book, and the unfolding drama overseas. But we also know that Du Bois returns from Germany, right, when he's younger, and having studied in Germany, and he's enamored with German culture, German academia. He's talking about Kant. He's like, I've learned about socialism.
He has the mustache that he wears for his entire life, right?
I'm trying to reconcile these two things: Du Bois's love of Germany and his viewpoint of seeing Germany as, like, he sees white supremacy inherent in this culture that he loves so much.
Yeah. I think that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. I mean, Du Bois studied at the University of Berlin. That was a transformative moment in his life, where he gained a respect for world culture, where he began to see a different set of possibilities beyond the color line of the United States. And that experience, informed his intellectual sensibilities, certainly his cultural tastes. He had a profound love for Germany, which he carried with him throughout his entire life. So I think what Du Bois does is he separates kind of the good parts of German history and culture from the bad stuff. I mean, Du Bois is someone who was always seeped in dialectics, right? And he recognized, obviously, the significant contributions that Germany had made to the world, to world history, culture, intellectualism, to himself personally. But he was also deeply familiar with the militarism, the nationalism, the racism that ran through German culture as well, that he also experienced when he was in Germany. And he was also deeply familiar with German imperialism. And this is really important for his understanding of the war. He makes the argument, one of the most prescient arguments, I would argue, of any intellectual in the 20th century. Origins of the war were rooted in European imperial competition and control of Africa and its human and material resources, right? And Germany was at the center of that. And he felt that because of the unique nature, the particularly kind of brutal nature of German imperialism, that he had to support the Allies during the war. It was a very difficult choice for him, but one that he ultimately, believed in and committed to wholeheartedly.
And so, Chad, you kind of usurped my next question. Maybe you were
imperial.
You were imperial in your reach. My questions. But that point about imperialism, wow, that just completely knocked me off my feet when I was reading about it throughout the book. And I should tell our audience that this is a theme throughout Chad's book, which is about that Du Bois sees the origins of World War I as imperial conquest, that this is a conflict between European nations and the savageness of the imperial vision. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? Because it flies in the face of everything that we know, or everything that historians tell us, right? Mainstream historians tell us about the origins of World War I.
Yeah. And again, I mean, Du Bois was truly ahead of his time. And he still is ahead of his time in many ways. I think scholars of World War I are still trying to catch up to the brilliance of that argument, the clairvoyance of that argument. And he was absolutely right. He was able to identify the global nature of the war and its particular impact on peoples of African descent in a way that no other scholar had done. And this is what he was trying to do in the book that he was writing, right? It was not just a history of the African-American experience in the First World War. It was a history of all peoples of African descent in the war. So he envisioned writing chapters on the future of Pan-Africanism in the wake of the war, the experiences of African colonial troops fighting in the French armies, Black soldiers fighting in the British armies. So he had a global conceptualization of not just the origins of the war, but its impact as well as its future as well. And this is how he was envisioning this really monumental book that he was trying to write and ultimately never completed. I mean, he gave the book a remarkable title, The Black Man and the Wounded World. And I think what Du Bois is trying to wrestle with is this incredibly profound question. What does it mean to live in a wounded world? What does it mean to live in a world that's shaped, that's scarred, that's wounded by war, by violence, by imperialism and colonial exploitation? Right? These were the core questions that he was trying to answer in his own personal experience, in wrestling with the war, but also in trying to write about it as well.
So I want to bring it back for a second and think about Du Bois and his different iterations, because, if anyone knows Du Bois, that he changes his mind like he changes his night clothes, right? And as early as really 1915, Du Bois is like, look, war is not great, but maybe we need to be concerned about this. And that changes over. And by 1917, I was struck by Du Bois in the melding of patriotism to Black America. Right, you mentioned Douglas, who is Du Bois's hero, and he quotes Douglas's very famous 1863 recruitment speech, right? But I was also struck by the way that Du Bois lionizes the Buffalo Soldiers, and how and this is something we continue to do today. I think you and I both were in a documentary on the Buffalo
That's right.
Soldiers.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we also know that it's well known that the Buffalo Soldiers are participating in atrocities
Absolutely.
during this period.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can talk us through this, like this way that Du Bois comes to embrace patriotism, tying it to citizenship, and uses as his evidence the experience of Black people.
Yeah. I mean, Du Bois really had a deep respect and veneration for the Black military tradition, even in his own familial history. I mean, he writes about how he had, a great-great-grandfather who served in the American Revolution, how his father served a brief stint in the Civil War. So he's trying to kind of marshal this martial past, this martial history, in his own sense of self and personhood. But I think what it comes down to, we can just take it back to The Souls of Black Folk, right? Where he writes about double consciousness, this sense of two-ness that African Americans experience, of being Black on the one hand and being American on the other. And he describes this as two warring ideals, right? In one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And he viewed war, and even more specifically as military service, as an opportunity to reconcile that sense of double consciousness, right? To become fully American, right? By wearing the uniform, by wrapping yourself up in the blanket of American patriotism. He believed that the World War was going to be a transformative moment in the history of African American citizenship, hearkening back to the Civil War, hearkening back to Douglas, right? When Black soldiers were at the tip of the spear, fighting in the Union Army for their freedom and for their eventual citizenship. Du Bois believed that the World War was going to be similar to that, but even on a grander scale, right? And ultimately he was wrong. And he had to reckon with, as I write about in the book, the failure of that decision.
Yeah, which I have this question about like success and failure, right? And it's ties to patriotism. So bear with me for a second. So it's a two-part question, but there's no person better to answer this.
Take your time.
I was struck by Mary Ovington White's quote that the country is mad over the Negro soldier, right? Like she writes this, and Du Bois is in Paris at the time, and he's like, yes, the country is mad. And to a certain effect, based on your research, the country is mad over the Black soldier, right? This is February 1919 that she's writing this.
Yeah.
You also mentioned that these soldiers, the Harlem Hellfighters, are going through New York in this parade. They are the pride and joy, and they're marching down, I think it's Fifth Avenue or something like that, but they start in the white part, the segregated white part of New York, and New Yorkers come out and they are happy, they are ecstatic. You say over 2 million people come to see them.
Incredible moment.
And there are parades of this ilk all over the country, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just not just the North, but also the South.
Yeah.
But then you pivot to the story of Daniel Mack. And Daniel Mack, if you guys don't know, is a serviceman who's returning home. He's in Georgia. He bumps into a white man violating the customs of the South. He's arrested, tried, convicted, sentenced to, hard labor. But before we can even get there, a mob drags him out and beats him within an inch of his life. But he is you say he is one of the lucky ones because he escapes. And then you give us a laundry list of Black servicemen who are murdered in the aftermath of returning home. Yeah. What are we to do with these two different perspectives, Chad?
Yeah.
They feel radically at odds, but your book tells us, no, they coexist. So tell us more.
They do. And I try and articulate that coexistence through Du Bois, and how on the one hand, he's returning back to the United States as well, along with these soldiers. Right? As you said, he spends time in France. He spends 3 months in France right after the armistice. And while he's in France, he's talking with Black soldiers and officers, right? He's literally on the Western Front. He's in the camps. He's seeing the devastation of the war with his own eyes. And these men are telling him about the horrific racial discrimination that they experienced, right? but they're also telling him about these incredible acts of heroism that they engaged in as well, right? How they were literally fighting on November the 11th, like right before the armistice went into effect, right? Trying to prove their worth, trying to prove their manhood, trying to prove the fitness of the race for full citizenship and recognition. So Du Bois comes back and he's very conflicted. He wants to tell their story, right? He wants to tell their story in all of its heroism and all of its ugliness, right? And that's really the larger story of the return of Black soldiers to the United States. As you say, African Americans welcome them back home as heroes, right? In Chicago, in New York, throughout the South. But at the same time, white Americans are terrified, right? What is it going to mean for these men who had been in France, who had experienced a taste of democracy, right? Who had worn the uniform of the United States and now are returning, viewing themselves as equal citizens. What is that going to mean for race relations in the United States? And there's this horrific backlash against African Americans and African American veterans in particular, right? And that's part of the Red Summer, right, that James Weldon Johnson talks about, that I write about, which also is part of Du Bois's confusion, right? This moment of euphoria that he was envisioning of the world being made safe for democracy, right? As Woodrow Wilson talked about. And he's returning back in the summer of 1919 just to bloodshed.
But in some respects, I wonder if they're right to be afraid, right? Like, so you talk about how, like, the NAACP does all these investigations, and every single investigation is like, white people are scared. Like they're scared that white people are gonna get in their britches and they're gonna want equality. And I think about like Du Bois, and he, when he fires off these, really fiery and intense, like, and it's more than just we return fighting, right? It's like letter after letter after letter, op-ed after op-ed through the crisis, where he's like, oh no, we're gonna fight back. We're gonna fight back, right? Yeah. So are they right to be scared? It doesn't mean I'm saying justifying the reaction. Clearly, I'm not. Absolutely. But
the war is absolutely a transformative moment in Black racial consciousness, in Black political consciousness, in Black militancy, right? The emergence of the New Negro movement. So you have a whole host of different organizations that come into existence, the most notable being Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. Black veterans play a very important role in that organization, both as actual members and leaders, but also symbolically as well. So absolutely, this specter of the new Negro, embodied by the Black veteran, is real. And white America is petrified by the possibility of Black people, as Du Bois writes about, returning fighting. And Du Bois, he kind of wraps himself in the symbolism of the new Negro. It's important. I mean, when Du Bois is in a very precarious place after the war, right? He writes Close Ranks, in 1918. He encourages African Americans to set aside their special grievances and close their ranks with America and the Allies, right? And he is just slayed. The criticism that he receives, nothing like he had ever received in his life. So after the war, he's in a very precarious place in terms of his leadership stature, as I write about in the book. And he tries to embrace this image of the new Negro to kind of rehabilitate himself, to demonstrate that he's still the militant race leader that he was before the war.
I was struck by how after the war, as he's writing these fiery, diatribes and things like that, and he's both trying to do the delicate balance of like, I don't want to piss off the leadership of the NAACP because I need this job, I need this platform, it's too important. But on the other hand, like, I need to get my radical credentials back.
Exactly.
And he starts writing it. Yeah. One of the things Chad does really well in this book is he shows how ordinary, everyday people who are aware of the NAACP and the crisis are like, no, actually, you're saying the right things, right?
Mhm.
I stopped my membership when you wrote close ranks, and now I'm gonna pay more.
Yeah,
And one of the reasons it seems that you allude to, or that you imply, is that the leadership of the NAACP lets him continue because he is bringing in more readers, more
yeah,
donors, more money when
yeah,
he becomes radicalized.
yeah, yeah. Du Bois, one of his gifts was having a acute sense of the mood of Black America. And he tapped into that. He recognized that there's something going on after the war, right? This heightened sense of militancy, of radicalism after the war is something that I need to address, something that I need to channel through my writings, through my voice, his singular voice. And it's not a coincidence. Those post-war issues of the crisis are the highest circulation issues in the crisis's history, over 100,000 readers. And new members start to come into the NAACP, right? So his white coworkers in the NAACP, like, they don't know what to do with Du Bois. They're like, oh, on the one hand, we need to control this guy. He needs to calm it down. But on the other hand, as you say, the NAACP, with him at the helm of the crisis, with James Weldon Johnson bringing in more members, with Walter White investigating lynch mobs in the South, it's becoming a true national organization, but also making inroads in the South as well, right? So Du Bois is and this moment after the war is really important for the NAACP as an institution, but also for the growth of what we now think of as the modern civil rights movement, right?
That's really quite powerful. So I know Du Bois is the radical, but one of the underlying, I think, themes that you do in this book is you point out how Du Bois has these really intense relationships with people, whether they want to have relationships or not. And so one of these people is Adam Patterson. And their relationship starts off with Du Bois insulting him, and not just insulting him privately, very publicly in 1912, being like, this guy's a bum and he's not worth anything in any kind of Black circles. But by 1919, they've established this kind of precarious relationship where it feels like Adam or Patterson is far more vested or far more optimistic about the relationship than Du Bois. And I'm wondering about, I've characterized like the short version. They're in this dance for a very long time.
Yeah.
And one of the remarkable things about it is how much Patterson contributes to the relationship and how little Du Bois acknowledges that contribution.
How little he
I wonder
reciprocates.
if you can
Yeah.
talk to our audience about this relationship between Patterson and Du Bois.
Yeah.
It,
It's really quite fascinating. And in some ways, it captures Du Bois's very complicated and, quite frankly, ugly relationship with many Black veterans. Adam Patterson was a major in the United States Army, one of the few Black majors who held the commission rank of major. And he formed a relationship with Du Bois in France when Du Bois visited France after the armistice. And he was envisioning himself as being essentially Du Bois's co-author in the history of the war that Du Bois was going to write, right? He saw himself maybe not necessarily as Du Bois's equal, but certainly as a key contributor, right, to this history that Du Bois was going to write. So Adam Patterson is mobilizing other soldiers, other officers to send Du Bois their materials, right? He's actually writing potential chapters for this book. And Du Bois, he gladly accepts all this material. He gladly accepts Patterson's generosity. But as years go on, as the book doesn't materialize, he doesn't reciprocate. Adam Patterson repeatedly asks him, when's the book coming out? Am I going to get acknowledged for my contributions? Du Bois always brushes him off. Don't worry, the book will be done. Yeah, don't worry, I'll acknowledge you. And it gets to the point where Patterson actually physically comes to New York, as I write about in the book, and says, look, I want my materials back. There are men who also want their materials back. And Du Bois, in all of his selfishness, in all of his ego, in all of his hubris, refuses to return his materials, just as he refuses to return the materials of many other veterans who believed in Du Bois, that he was going to be the one to tell their story. And it's really part of the tragedy of this history that I write. The fact that all of these materials, all these deeply personal materials, letters, diaries, photographs, they're still sitting in an archive.
And so, I really struggled with this. Uh, how important that stuff is, particularly for the narrative. And I still feel an urgency around, as you're telling this story, for Du Bois to publish the material. And my urgency is such that I'm like, you know what? What's a little plagiarism? So I'm wondering, Chad, if you could talk us through this like discrepancy that's good that you showcase quite, in all of its complications.
Right. So again, Du Bois spends 20 years trying to write this book. It's an incredibly long period of time. And he struggles to write this book, as I argue, unlike any other book that he tried to write. Ultimately producing a manuscript over 800 pages long, still incomplete, right? And I believe his struggle to write the book, the conflicts that he has with the men who contributed to it, is really reflective of Du Bois's own internal conflicts about the war itself. The fact that he went against his own principles, his own anti-war principles, to support this war, believing that it was going to be this transformative moment in American democracy, in world democracy, and he was wrong, right? He writes as early as 1920 in his book, Darkwater, how great a failure, and a failure in what does the World War betoken, right? And he spends, the entire interwar period trying to reckon with that failure, trying to reckon with his own confusion in why he supported the war and the type of world that this horrific war created. So ultimately, his inability to publish the book, is reflective of his own inability to find any positive meaning in the war, especially when World War II arrives, right? And I think as brilliant as Du Bois is, as brilliant as Du Bois was, he was still deeply flawed in many ways, right? And what I try and do in my book is to talk about what those flaws and contradictions meant in his own intellectual and political evolution, and ultimately what we can take away from them.
So I'm going to talk about a couple more of those flaws.
Sure.
And they're two that I really want to highlight, and you can do what you will with them. The first is, I believe it's Scott. Is it?
Emmett Scott?
Yes, Emmett Scott.
Yeah.
And Emmett Scott is the only person who ends up publishing a book on Black soldiers in World War I. And I'm curious about, and Du Bois very clearly sees him as an enemy and as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious about their relationship, because at the end of the day, Scott is the one who publishes the work.
He does.
That's the first one. The second one is, as Du Bois is making this argument about imperialism, European imperialism, he is also fighting with Marcus Garvey. Right? Marcus Garvey, who is also making an argument about imperialism on the continent of Africa. Right?
Right.
There might be slight differences, but we know that when Garvey first gets to New York, Du Bois is over the moon with the kind of analysis that Garvey is offering.
Yeah.
Talk us through, and I think these two vendettas, which are personal vendettas, both personal and
Very
professional
personal.
vendettas.
Yeah.
I think they're linked. I think they have a common trait. But
Yeah.
I leave that to you to argue for or against. Help us understand this.
Yeah, well, I think that that common trait is Du Bois in his ego, his elitism, his belief that he was the spokesperson for the race, right?
Mm.
And he viewed Emmett Scott, who was Booker T. Washington's secretary at the Tuskegee Institute, as a threat, right? Because he was also attempting to write his own history of the war. I go into all the juicy details surrounding that in the book. Don't want to give away too much, but he certainly saw Emmett Scott as not only being a threat to his leadership, but also being a threat to an accurate historical telling of the history of the war. That he was intellectually second rate, right? And he essentially was not qualified to write the history of the war like the great Du Bois, Harvard, PhD, University of Berlin, educated, author of Souls of Black Folk, on and on, right? So again, this speaks to Du Bois's ego, his conceit, kind of similar to Marcus Garvey. He saw some aspects of Garvey's program that were appealing, but he was ultimately turned off by Garvey's flamboyance, by his financial mismanagement, as Du Bois characterized it, viewing him essentially as a charlatan, right, as a demagogue. And that feud became very personal. And there's been a lot written that Du Bois describes a fat, ugly man with small eye. I mean, just really kind of nasty personal stuff. But it does, I think, speak to this larger issue of how Du Bois saw himself and saw himself in relation to the race, right? He was the ultimate race man.
Of gender and masculinity. And I think that's a constant thread, but it's not just a constant thread to your book, but it's a constant thread that motivates Du Bois, right? There's the question of Black manhood, and that's really important. One of the more surprising things, I think, was the concept of rape, right? Servicemen, Black servicemen, and you write about this, right, in all its intentionality, are accused of horrific, right, rapes amongst French towns.
Yeah.
And that becomes the story, not just that white generals or white majors are telling, or people returning from war, but ultimately that the War Department enters in as the official story of Black servicemen, right? As they discount Black servicemen and say that physically they are not equipped, but also sexually they're too energetic. And what ends up happening is that over the course of his lifetime, as Du Bois is busy with all of these other things, yes, he is writing about Black manhood, but he is taking the time out to methodologically dispute the accusation of rape. This enrages him whenever it comes out.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about why Du Bois is so concerned with the question of rape. This, because I mean, he writes lots of op-eds. It's central to why he says, I have to publish this book. I have to publish this book, right? And then the second part of this question is, Du Bois never publishes this book. So that means that the story of the War Department becomes the official narrative around Black servicemen. Like, what are we to do with that?
So I think, I mean, it speaks to, I mean, in some ways, the title of Du Bois's book, right? The Black Man and the Wounded World. He envisioned his book being this story about Black manhood, right? It's the kind of the heroism of Black manhood and through the experiences of Black soldiers, but also the attacks on Black manhood in terms of the racial discrimination institutionalized within the United States Army, these accusations of rape, of incompetence being levied on Black officers. So he was deeply invested in this history that he was trying to write, but also, as you said, throughout his career, in trying to reclaim the honor and dignity of Black manhood and seeing that as essential to the broader dignity and uplift of the race, right? So again, this was, I think, part of his lifelong intellectual project. And you're right, again, you know, this book is, my book, is in some ways a tragedy, right? And I had to really reckon with that in writing the book and conceptualizing it, but ultimately embracing it. And one of the tragic aspects of the book is that he doesn't finish The Black Man and the Wounded World. And yes, I mean, it is the stories, the narratives of racist white military officials that become the official history, even though Emmett Scott publishes his book, right? That narrative of Black soldiers as not having any significant contribution to the war carries on throughout World War II, right? And even beyond World War II. So that's part of Du Bois's ongoing disillusionment, right? And ultimately why I think he felt so much regret and disappointment that he wasn't able to finish this book, right? He's reckoning with that failure to finish this book really up until the end of his life.
Yeah, and it's such a contrast between, again, that really brief period in 1919 when everyone is celebrating these Black men that are coming home and these servicemen. But the moment they start to push back in any way, shape, or form, it's absolutely not.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to open up the questions to the audience.
Yes,
We
let's
ask
do
you, you know, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll try our best to get through them. And I'm actually going to ask my last question, which is a question from the chat, which is that you end the book by pointing out that even as late as 1971, after Du Bois, many years after Du Bois has died, there's an attempt to publish The Black Man and the Wounded World. And everyone looks at it and says, we can't do it, right? And I'm curious if this book will ever be published. And then, of course, the side question is, are you going to be the one to do it?
You know, I wouldn't be so arrogant to believe that I can finish Du Bois's book for him. It's really a remarkable manuscript. Some of the chapters are complete. They are brilliantly written. They sing with Du Bois's beautiful prose. Other chapters are very much a work in progress. Some chapters he hadn't even finished writing yet. So it's definitely a messy manuscript. But in some ways, that's kind of the beauty of it. We would be able to see Du Bois working through his ideas about the war over really a 2-decade period and how this remarkable manuscript evolves over time. So I think there is hopefully a great opportunity to present that to the public in some way, shape, or form. There are some larger questions regarding permissions and publication rights that need to be addressed with the Du Bois estate in particular. But I would certainly love to try and think about what this incredible manuscript could look like in some type of published form.
You heard it here, folks.
But don't hold me to it. Don't hold me to it.
Yeah, don't. I mean, unlike Du Bois, this book got published. But you heard it here first. So we have actually a lot of questions in the queue, and I think we're just going to jump right into it. And I think the second question, actually, the first question was a question I just asked, but the second question is, how much did Du Bois's We Return Fighting, this 1919 editorial,
Returning Soldiers,
piece, right? How does this absolve him from his earlier piece, Close Rank, his editorial support? And And I think it's the questioner is asking not just in terms of his broad public audience, but in terms of like thought leaders, like A. Philip Randolph,
Yeah.
his critics, Francis, the Grimke, right, and others.
Mhm.
So does it absolve him? Does it get him in their good graces again?
Yeah, I think Du Bois was very conscious about what he was writing when he returns to the United States in early 1919. The May and June issues of the Crisis magazine, which I focus on in one of my chapters. He was using his editorial perch, right, his power as editor of the Crisis, to rehabilitate his image and to reassert his leadership stature and to prove all of his skeptics wrong. And he accomplishes that to a degree. I think the reading public begins to kind of forgive Du Bois a bit. But amongst Black radicals, in Harlem and elsewhere, they do not cut Du Bois any slack, right? A. Philip Randolph, Chandler Owen, William Monroe Trotter, his one-time ally, certainly Marcus Garvey, they continue to view Du Bois as a traitor to the race, right? And Du Bois, he has to live with that criticism, really for the rest of his life. It sticks with him. But that was a very important moment, again, in Du Bois trying to rehabilitate himself, but also not being completely successful in doing so.
I mean, again, you heard it here first. Du Bois has fallen out with his peers, and it sustains. That's a really kind of big deal, especially since he outlives so many of them, right? Like that's a sticking point. We have another question here, and I think this one is actually helpful in us understanding Du Bois and his connection to this international kind of program, which is from Marilyn, who wants to know, how long is Du Bois in Europe? And she's thinking, continuously, like from graduate work through the end of his life. We know that he journeys to Europe a lot, but how much of his life is made up of that?
He has several stints in Europe. The first being during his graduate school years when he's at the University of Berlin. He also spends time in Europe in 1900 when he's organizing an exhibition at the Paris World Exposition, also attends the first Pan-African Congress in London in 1900. As I write about in the book, he spends a really remarkable 3 months in France immediately after the armistice. He returns to Europe on several occasions in organizing his Pan-African Congresses in 1921, 1923, also in 1925. In 1926, he visits Germany, which is struggling in the aftermath of the war, but also, most importantly, he visits the Soviet Union for the first time. And this is really the beginning of his attraction to revolutionary Marxism and the beginnings of his an evolution to the left. I also talk about in the book when he spends time in Europe and specifically Germany in 1936. He's in Germany in the summer of 1936 during the Olympic Games, where Adolf Hitler is putting the Third Reich on full display and is conflicted, we talked about earlier, about what to make of this. On the one hand, he's enjoying everything about Germany and German culture and visiting places where he had been as a young man, but he's also seeing literally the seeds of the next World War. Also travels to Imperial Japan. So his times in Europe, and he spends additional time in Europe in the 1950s. But really this moment in Europe in 1936 in particular is critically important and really serves as a moment where he begins to think about the book that he's writing, The Black Man and the Wounded World, as being an urgent lesson in the horrors of modern warfare. And if he can get this book published right after he returns, from, as I said, literally seeing the next World War on the horizon, maybe, just maybe, it can have an impact. And it doesn't happen, by 1940, when he ultimately decides that he's not going to finish the book, World War II is here, and more catastrophic than this World War.
That is a perfect segue for the next question that has come from multiple audience members.
Okay.
All want to know, why is the book not finished? Right? And I think it's more than just Du Bois decides, I'm not going to do it anymore. There's something that I think you talk about, like the process, one by which why it continues to be delayed, right? He claims that he has a draft by like 1923. It's done by 1923 and out to press.
Yeah.
But it's not.
Yeah.
And then there's the question of why doesn't he finish it? He finishes Black Reconstruction during this period. If you don't know, our audience members, Black Reconstruction is like 800 pages long.
Another big book.
Right. It is massive. Yeah. So please, Chad, enlighten us.
Yeah. Well, read the book, right? But certainly there's practical reasons that Du Bois had challenges in finishing the book. He was always busy. He was always thinking about the next book to write, including Black Reconstruction. He was at the forefront of literally every issue facing Black people in the United States and throughout the diaspora. He struggled to get research support. Foundations, philanthropists, as I write about in the book, didn't want to support the project. So there were a lot of practical obstacles in his way. But ultimately, the big obstacle was Du Bois himself and his inability to make sense of the war and his own complicated place in it. You mentioned Black Reconstruction, right? He actually envisioned The Black Man in the Wounded World as being kind of like a sequel to Black Reconstruction at one point, right? But whereas he could view the history of Reconstruction as history, the World War was still very much the present for Du Bois. It was still ongoing. He was still living through it. The world was still living through its legacies. And that made it incredibly difficult for him to write about. And ultimately, the weight of the magnitude of the history and his own disillusionment with it prevented him from completing the book.
I mean, there's a certain kind of irony here too, because if you ask any sociologist in the United States, they all will say, they'll credit Du Bois to some extent with the founding of modern American sociology.
Yeah, they like to claim Du Bois as their own.
They love to claim him, but
historians,
historians
we know, right?
We know. I mean, English literature people are claiming him too, when you look at like the Dark Princess and all that stuff. Right. But you look at the Philadelphia Negro, which he is able to write, and you say, well, why couldn't he write the Wounded World in a way that was sociological? And I think, Chad, exactly to your point, he saw it as history, but he was still living through it. That presents, a deeply complex problem. Yeah. We have another question. I think this is a relatively quick question. One of our audience members says, to their recollection, Du Bois eventually renounces his citizenship with the U.S. and actually dies in Ghana in the 1960s. And this is how you end the book, with Du Bois accepting Nkrumah's invitation to Ghana, and he's in a lavish, I think you say like a 7-bedroom mansion, and he dies peacefully. And where upon his death, his widow opens this really poignant and beautiful letter. And so our audience member says, in what ways do you believe this unfinished manuscript may have led to his there's a question in there too about heart. It seems like he's hearkening some of Garvey's philosophies.
And I think that's a really perceptive question. In some ways, how I end the book with Du Bois in Ghana, leaving the United States. He never renounces his American citizenship, but he certainly leaves the United States and views it, as he tells Shirley Graham Du Bois, as kind of a final trip, right? That, given his age, that he's not going to, consider returning back to the United States at this point. But it speaks to where Du Bois is by 1961. He's persona non grata in many circles of Black America, particularly amongst kind of mainstream civil rights the Cold War, Red Scare. He is considered to be a threat to Black advancement. So Du Bois really, I mean, he's deeply hurt by this because he's someone who believed that he had the potential to make America live up to its ideals, for America to fully be the democracy that it purported itself to be, right? By the end of his life, right, he's realizing that America, even in his final years, has failed to live up to its democratic potentials and its ideals. So I think his failure to complete his book, which is really a story about democracy in many ways, is also reflective of his struggles to embrace America and all of its failures when it comes to democracy for Black people.
So, Chad, we only have a couple minutes left, and we have a million questions. And so what we try and do is take three that I think are asking really provocative things and that are perhaps related, and ask you all three, and you can answer as you see fit. So the first one is, you've talked a lot about his, exploitative, flawed interpersonal relationships. Can you highlight something more about his healthy, successful relationships? That's number one. And number two is more of a comment, which is, thank you for this wonderful conversation. This person, Catherine Lewis, says her research came across some Du Bois papers and photos with regard to World War I. Papers included a letter from the military denying his request for a World War I officer's appointment. Also photos of World War I nurses and officers' photos. I look forward to reading your books. That's number two. And then the last, influenced and perhaps changed your own thinking about the Black experience. So we've got healthy relationships, Bois' appointment, and then how's your thinking changed? I think these are interrelated.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly talk about Du Bois's messiness, but he has some really incredible relationships with a number of individuals who I talk about in the book. What right, without any contradiction after the war, and he dies in Nigeria in 1922. Just this tragic end to his incredible life and career, and Du Bois is deeply affected by this. So that relationship I talk about in the book, his relationship with Joel Spingern, his relationship with John Hope, his close friend at Morehouse, his relationship with James Weldon Johnson, right? These are all individuals who shaped Du Bois's life, who were involved in various ways in his journey to write the history of the war, who he all outlived, right? So again, I mean, Du Bois, 95 years old, he had to reckon with the weight of history, but also his personal history as well, in all of its messiness, but also in all of its beauty and really the importance of those relationships. So there are other questions. The military commission, again, I can go into a lot of detail about that. I talk about it in the book. It's part of the intrigue surrounding closed ranks. Du Bois was angling for a captaincy in the military intelligence division at the same time as he's writing Closed Ranks, and this blew up in his face, was part of why he was criticized so heavily by the end of the war. And then the last question, which I'm forgetting. I'm sorry.
That's the question. How has doing this changed you? How's it affected you?
Oh, well, I have I've always respected Du Bois. I think as as Black scholars, Du Bois is kind of, he's in the pantheon, right? But I have a deeper appreciation for him in terms of his humanity, in terms of his complexity, but also in terms of his failure, right? And what it means for the great W.E.B. Du Bois to fail at something. And ultimately, what that failure tells us about him and his ability to grow, to evolve, to become, by the 1950s, a radical peace activist, how failure for Du Bois, how failure for Du Bois was generative, and how he learned from his mistakes. And that's something that I think we can all take away from Du Bois, from my book, and in our own experiences in trying to reckon with the wounded world, right?
Absolutely. And I have to say, Professor Williams, you go into this in such depth, such complexity, such nuance in the book. You should all pick up support. We want to thank you for tuning in to our webinar for our author discussion. Thank you again to the Center for Brooklyn History for hosting us. And thank you to Dr. Chad Williams for writing this beautiful and brilliant book. Thank you.
Thank you, friend. Appreciate it.
And thank you, Leah, and thank you, Chad. Thank you for this spectacular conversation. I can't think of a conversation that would make a person want to read a book more. This was like a spectacular conversation about the man and the history and the world and so much more. Thank you so much. Thank all of you for being here, and look forward to seeing you the next time. Have a good night.